So hello everybody, this is the Gage Gallery Artist Collective and my name is Midori Yamada, and what you're about to see is the artworks from the last 90 days, the majority of the work. And I will talk about a couple of the other pieces that precede it. And here we go. So this first piece that we're looking at, I began in mid-April, and this particular shape and movement is something that occurs in a lot of my work, and it showed up again. I don't necessarily intend for it to be there, but it was one of the last gestures that actually happened with this piece. And most of the pieces I'm going to show us are mixed media pieces on canvas, and I use Japanese washi papers. So this bright orange one, which we will see in a number of pieces, is about the only one that comes that color. Everything else comes kind of a neutral color, and then they're hand painted. So these little inserts are ways for me to articulate the plane and to show us where parts of the painting exist. So I started working with this particular color palette, which are these kind of turquoises and blues and greens. And they are my favorites, and you're going to see that much of the show actually has this kind of palette. So this is the first one, and then we'll move along. So there's as I mentioned, there's a couple of pieces that are a little bit older, like this one, but has many of the same elements. So these are hand-tinted Japanese papers, and you can see in some cases that there's a lot of layering happens. I do this kind of pleating and folding, and because of the transparency of the paper, what you get are ghost images of what's underneath it. So same thing here. So all of these areas, including, I'm going to just move this way. So this area of the painting here is actually done on a separate Japanese washi paper, and I did an impression of a leaf. It dried, and then I did the back washes, and then the papers get put into the canvas. But again, because of the transparency, you can just see the slight differentiation between where the washi is and where the canvas is on its own. I like this long, narrow format. It's somewhat landscape in its feeling, but it's not supposed to be a landscape. Like in my head, I don't think, oh, going to make a landscape. So as I said, this is a slightly older piece, and I'm going to jump across. We're not going to go in order. So there are two canvases of this particular size, and the title is Cascadia. This is Cascadia 2, and the painting in the front window that we saw at the beginning is Cascadia 1. And I'm making a direct reference to the Pacific Northwest. So this has to do with the area in Canada into the United States, and it makes reference to, from my standpoint, the kind of natural elements that we see here: water, wind, waves, lots of weather. So a lot of the elements here are making either direct or oblique reference to the energies of nature. So once again, the areas that appear to be cut out are done on different kinds of Japanese papers. And you know, they have different kind of time periods, because I have a whole library of images and patterns that I just keep literally as a library, and I will bring them out depending on what it is I'm working on. So on these canvases, the first things that happen are these big gestural sweeps, and there's quite a lot of texture involved here. I've added pumice, so these big gestural sweeps, and then I let it sit and I look at the canvas, and in a sense I do a kind of investigation. Okay, what is it I'm trying to express about this particular movement with this particular format and using this kind of, this color scheme. So here there are these reasonably pale tints of, I don't want to say tan, but they're sand colored. So I wanted the feeling of, if there's movement around rocks or wind or whatever, there's always these kind of atmospheric things that happen in nature. So a lot of this is to mimic really what happens when you either move quickly or less quickly with brush and with different kinds of pigments. One of the things I started to do in this particular series is I started to include areas on canvas. So this is pumice and acrylic on canvas, and that was cut out and then put in. So these give me a reference to things that are very kind of earth-like. They're very, very dark. They're meant to be, in a sense, like these little tunnels. So you have this kind of wind element, and then direct imagery from nature, and then these kind of mysterious little things that we don't quite know what they are, which is fine, you know. In all of my work, even though myself, I feel that they are referencing nature, I'm not trying to necessarily impose that. It's more like a feeling that I get as I make it, so, and a kind of feeling and response. So those are those two big ones, and then I think we can come this way now. So the next series that I painted at the same time, and I have to mention that when I have the opportunity, I work on a number of formats with a number of ideas at the same time. I don't mean at the same time literally like this, but I'll work a number of days on this kind of format. So for instance, this first color in the background, I may do a number of canvases and then I leave them and I let them cure, and then I'll move on to, say, this format, and then I will do something on these and I put them aside. So it's a little bit like I'm keeping all of these kind of ideas and balls up in the air at the same time, and then every time I come into the studio I look at what's been done, and it's really more of a kind of a conversation that I have energetically with the work. So there are certain days where my energy is smaller. So I don't have a plan in advance, oh, it's Tuesday, I have to work on these large canvases. It's quite the opposite. I come in, the first thing I do is I clean, and I put things away, and I make everything orderly. And then I take things out and I look at them, and I go, okay, so now, for instance, in this particular series, which is called From Silence, and there's a number of them, they began also mid-April, but they didn't come to completion until maybe a couple of weeks ago. So sometimes what will happen is there's certain elements I'll get so far, and then I stop because it's not obvious what the next step is. So again, a lot of the decision making isn't coming strictly from an intellectual, oh, this is red, I need to put this next to it. It's a much more fluid and evolving kind of relationship that's also based on all of the other things that I'm doing. And one of the things that if there's a habit that I try to follow or try to create, is to try not to mimic myself. Just because I've done something in one painting or in one series, the next one that's the same size, I don't think, oh, well, because I did that stroke, it has to be in this next one. In a way, it's the reverse. I try to avoid becoming a caricature of myself. You know? So then I started to work in a square format, and it's not a usual format for me. I'm not entirely sure why that is. So I did it as much as an experiment as possible. And this final color on the ground actually is a number of layers of these different kinds of turquoises. And if we look across the room at the other ones in the series, you'll see that they are similar, but they're not the same. Okay, there are all these shades of blue, blue-green, and in fact, so this particular series, which is called C squared, S-E-A, C squared, the first gesture is one that is somewhat hidden. It has an embossed quality, so I used a product to bulk up that first, those first gestures. But then with a number of coats of different colored pigments in the same tonal range, then what happens is they get pushed back to the back plane. And then what happens is then, I look through my library of, for the most part, pre-painted Japanese papers, and these are all, so this is actually a very good example. I'm actually going to park myself here so I can point to it. This is a very good example of a composition wherein I've used, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So there are 8 different kinds of Japanese papers in this particular canvas, which is a 20-inch square. Plus, I started to use some of the Japanese silks that I bought the last time I was in Japan. So the Japanese are, one of the things the Japanese are known for are their intricate patterning in terms of textiles. So for the most part, the inserts, the material inserts in my work are silk, and they're of different thicknesses, different weights, and up to, I would say, quite recently, the Japanese had, okay, from a Occidental Western standpoint, a kind of phobia about using something that's been used, which is why so many Japanese antiques are available, including Japanese kimono. For many, many years, the idea of buying or wearing something that belonged to someone else was just not a part of their thinking. It's changed now a little bit. So when you go to Japan, you actually have access to a lot of old and contemporary fabric, because if someone passes away or they want to get rid of it, they just take it to the store and there it is. And they're not particularly interested in it. Again, it's changing somewhat. But so this part here, it is a square of Japanese silk. And again, what I'm looking for is not only a kind of a harmony in putting these things together, but I'm also looking for a feeling of contrast. And so the paper here is much thicker than the one that's in front of it, that's actually been doubled over. But it's so transparent that it's showing you what's underneath, including some of the embossed gestural parts here. And then, you know, I started to incorporate some of these folded areas, and then, even though we shouldn't be touching the artwork, some of them have these, you know, holes punched and string, or in this case, I think it's seagrass. I'm gonna have to check. Anyway, again, so I'm looking for something that's bringing the composition really to the frontal plane. So you've got this kind of play between what is really in the back plane coming towards the front of the canvas. This is another example here. And again, you know, if you can see, even though tonally it's the same, but there's an embossed quality from the first big gesture that went down. Okay, so there's another one here. And once again, you can see there's an underneath gesture, there's a darker gesture, and then, so this particular piece of washi, there was already this symbol partly there, and then it kind of, it dropped back too much for me, so then I imposed it right on top once again. And one of the things that I try to do with these works is by not overworking the actual strokes of the paint. So for instance, if you look at this gestural part here, it's really a single movement or two. It has, unlike oil paint where you scrape back and you're trying to create volume or mass or distinction, this really comes through, the gesture, the speed of the gesture, the imposition of one thing over the other, dart, light, contrast, etc. So I'm trying to create those same things, but using very relatively unmanipulated marks. I'll put it that way. Of course it's manipulated, it's your hand, but that's the intention. So once again here there's, in this particular one, 2, 3, 4. 4 pieces of different kinds of washi, and the reason I mention that is because of how thick they are, whatever fiber it is, they accept paint and ink in different ways. They're quite different. And then I have 2 pieces of the Japanese silk here. Yeah. So I'd like to take us across here and talk a little bit about these round pieces, which are quite relatively new for me. So certainly in a mixed media context, they're very new. One of the very first woodcuts I did when I was in school, which was a long time ago, I did use this round format, but it's something that, oh no, that's true. Yes, so actually there was another time. So during the late 60s into the early 70s, a lot of hard edge painting was popular then. And so in fact, yes, I did use this kind of circular shape. And so the shape was drawn on the canvas, and then very meticulously you'd put a band of masking tape to get that perfect circle, and then paint the circle, and then let it dry and mask this side, and then paint the other side. But I would say in the last number of years, I haven't explored a circular format, and I'm very interested once again in it for a number of reasons, which I'll talk about in a second. So in this particular work, when we take a picture of this and you put it on a screen, my hope is that you cannot see or discern its size by looking at it. It could be 4 inches, it could be 40 inches. So I'm looking for that kind of play in terms of all of the elements, that it feels balanced enough, that there's enough information going on, but yet you cannot quite tell what its size is. Mm-hmm. And in this particular piece, I've included this particular paper, which is a found paper, and it was gifted to me by a friend, and what it consists of is formula, but it's in another language, and we haven't discerned which language it is. Right now it's upside down, so it's impossible. So not only are there mathematical symbols and equations, but it's in a language that no one that I know has been able to say. It could be Czech. We're thinking it's Eastern European, but we're not sure. So sometimes I like to include found pieces of text, and I'm using it as a graphic, but I like the fact that it's telling us something, but we don't know what it is. And not only that, I've purposely folded it so even if you could read it, standing on your head, knowing the foreign language, you still could not completely logically decipher what it's saying. So part of what I'm interested in is revealing something, but also pointing to the fact that there's always a mystery about it, regardless how much you think you're saying or showing or proclaiming. There's, for me, if the art is to remain interesting once it's done, so once the artist is finished with it, that there's some kind of communication that's going on that's beyond logic. So for me, that part of it is important. Okay. And there's another one here. And in this particular one, once again, there are many different kinds of Japanese paper. This particular one here, which I really love, very textured. And this one I bought in Japan. And I bought it in the store of a teeny village called Kuratani, and it is barely on the map. It's a dot on the map, and the little minibus that takes you there will drop you off at the side of the road. That's how big this, it's a village, it's not even a town. And it's one of the places in Japan that still makes handmade Japanese papers, and they're magnificent. So sometimes this is a piece of silk, sometimes I will put in something that as is, so this is not tinted by me. It's been overlaid here with color that I've put in, but sometimes I will put in something that exists already as it is. And we can kind of come this way, so you'll see that once again this is the C² series. And this was our mathematical folded secret here, overlaid with another paper, tied together. So it just peeks out, we can kind of see it. And again, I'm using this also structurally to start to bring the work off the frontal plane really into 3 dimensions without making 3-dimensional. So there's an interplay between the 2-dimensional elements and then the obvious more 3-dimensional. Also from Silence, same format. So this particular shape, which is circular, not unlike here, but it's made by using a tool, and the movement is really tries to be very, I don't want to say one stroke, not quite, but not too manipulated. So sometimes what happens with these last strokes is there's a kind of like, I hold my breath. It's like, okay, I think this needs to go here. And the thing is, if it fails, it fails. So there's a kind of element of risk in it that I don't mind. I think that's fine. What else can we, there's one small one here. Let me pick this up. This is probably the smallest piece. Yeah. So that's also in the rondel series. I'll hold it on the wall. It's a teeny weeny piece. And also the difference with this rondel series is the work is on wood, and it's not something that I do too often. I'm usually more used to working on the canvas, but in this case, I stain the ground as opposed to painted it because I wanted to include the actual texture of the wood itself. I find that kind of interesting as an element. Like that. And is there anything else I can show us? So do you have any questions, Efren? Please ask a question.
Okay, my question will be going back to the brown paintings. Tell us why you went back to that format, and what makes you, what prompt the idea of, I should work on this.
So one of the symbols and we actually started with this, is this circular shape, okay, which is the last shape that really, one of the last shapes or gestures that happened on this first canvas. And when we go across the room, we can see once again. So this actually is a Japanese symbol. And there's something very satisfying about making it. So when you're practicing calligraphy or just playing with brush, to put your brush, load up your brush and to put it down and to draw this beautiful circle without stopping. There's something very kind of magical that happens. So that particular movement, for me, is a very natural movement. And at the same time, as I mentioned in some of the series, so I mentioned here, there's the same circular movement. It's full though, there's no space in the middle. And in some of the other ones are going to make you come across this way. So this one has been cut off, this Enso shape. And In a sense, it refers back to some of the work in one of my last shows, I guess 2 shows ago. And that show was called Orb, O-R-B. And the name of the show came to me before I knew what it was about. So I had to do a kind of a dictionary. What does that mean? I mean, it refers in a sense to something like Earth, orbital. It has to do with the eyeball, so things that are circular. And I believe in photography, when you have, so this is old photography, I think it's probably pre-digital. When you have little floating particles of dust, sometimes you'll take something, particularly at night, and you'll get these haloed effects, and they're round and they're beautiful, and they ruin a good photograph. But what I love about them is there's this feeling of there's something there, but it's not anything. It's something, but it's nothing. So that's one cue. And the other thing is, when you are playing with, I'm just going to show us this particular work on Japanese paper. When you work very freely with the Japanese paper, so you're going to see there's a kind of a central area here, and then the color starts to move out until you have this corrugated edge. So there are certain movements that you can do with paint and ink and water on very absorbent surfaces that give you these kind of crenellated, and they're somewhat circular. So I wasn't trying to make a circle. So part of it is that some of the things that arrive somewhat spontaneously and somewhat naturally, so think about dropping a stone in water. What happens? Ripples, right? Think about doing a cross cut of an old tree. There's a center, and every year, as the water enters, the tree gets bigger. So when you look, what do you see? In fact, if we look down here, right at the ground, let's look over here. Okay, so this is the floor pattern. This is actually from wood. So all of a sudden you get these, starts off round, and then the shape starts to billow out. So all of those things are things that happened in my work that pointed me towards, okay, why not actually start with perfectly round? And one of my students in Montreal who teaches mathematics, when she saw these pieces, she said, well, you know, Heather, you know that the circle is a perfect shape. And she said, we're going to have to talk about that later. So for me, there's a number of things that refer to this sense of perfection, or no beginning or no end, okay, and a kind of feeling of limitlessness. So on the one hand, of course, when you're looking directly at a piece, there is a limit, meaning this is where the piece is and this is where it's not. So we know there's a boundary, okay? By the same token, when we actually hone in on something and look at it, hopefully there is a feeling of no limit, something without boundary. So there's something very satisfying about this circular shape, and my next paintings, I'm going to go bigger with them. So I'm very excited.
Only my last question about the title of the show.
Yes, Brink.
Why Brink?
Well, again, sometimes the titles of the show come to me before I understand what it's about. So this was definitely the case for this show. I knew I wanted to show this work. I didn't know what the context was. The context, in fact, was the shutdown that happened because of the pandemic, because of COVID-19. And like most people on the planet, you know, I had my eye very much on the news to see what was happening. And there was something very dire about everything that was happening. So when you think of the word brink, first of all, it's monosyllabic, and so my show titles tend to be monosyllabic, and people think, why did she call it that? So brink refers to, refers to edge or verge. So to be on the brink of something, often there's a feeling of something that's ominous, something that's going to happen. But for me, it wasn't so much sense of ominous, but literally that we're on a precipice all the time. And depending on what we decide, which way we move, whether we go forward or not go forward, something will happen, for better or worse. So for me, I take it as a point of opportunity, you know, because one of the comments I've had so far about friends who've looked at the show, they said, oh, it's so colorful. And then when I tell them, I say, you know, this work has been done during the pandemic, and a lot of people are very surprised because of the color. Well, so, you know, as an individual, I've taken in what everybody's taken in and felt the distress of that and the instability of that. And yet, because of that, you know, so for me, the good part of that is I've actually had time to be by myself, to be with my work on a continuous basis. I would say 5 out of 7 days I get to the studio. This hasn't happened for me in decades. So I've had that privilege of being able to stay with the work and have the work come up to me, and then I look at it and think, okay, what is that? And then do something, and then do something else, and then go to another series and try something. Now, what we're not seeing are the canvases that were less successful. It would be actually very interesting, maybe at another time, that I will invite Efren to my studio and show him the works that are integral to this show that don't quite work. And I would actually love to talk about that, because often we see the so-called successes of artists, and it would be good to for us to look at the pieces that I feel they're pointing to something, but they're not especially successful as pieces. So I'm not going to hide them away. I'm actually going to show it to you. So stay tuned for part 2.